Good morning. Welcome to the common course Spectrum, Literature and Contemporary Issues. This class onwards, I will be handling Nina ma'am's portions. We can start with the last chapter in Module 3. The chapter is Jamaican Fragment, written by A.L. Hendricks. Have you heard about A.L. Hendricks? Let us start with A.L. Hendricks. A.L. Hendricks was born in 1922 in Kingston, Jamaica, to a Jamaican father and a French mother. Hendricks was educated at Jamaica College and briefly at Ottershaw College in Surrey, England. After joining the family business for a few years, he entered broadcasting in 1950. He became director of Caribbean Broadcasting in Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago Television. Hendricks was born in 1922 in Jamaica. After his education, he joined the family business. He became director of Caribbean Broadcasting in Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago Television. In 1961, he was general manager of the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation, after which he became a television director in London. In the late 1960s, he moved to Bermuda, where he was resident director of Thomson Television. After this, he settled in England. He became a freelance writer in 1971. He wrote both poems and short stories and travelled widely throughout the Caribbean. The BBC's Caribbean Voices program featured his work several times. So we can see that in 1960s, Hendricks moved to Bermuda. Then he became the resident director of Thomson Television. After that, he settled in England. In 1971, he became freelance writer. Then he started to write poems and short stories. He was also interested in traveling. As the result, he traveled widely throughout the Caribbean. If you want to get the details about his works, you can watch the BBC's Caribbean Voices program. His early collections of verse, which include On This Mountain and other poems, it was published in 1965, Mute Poems published in 1971, and These Green Island and other poems published in 1971 made use of rigorously economical forms to frame their imaginative commentaries on a wide range of personal and social concerns. The long title sequence of The Islanders, it was published in 1983, a vivid evocation of the human and natural aspects of the Caribbean, marked the emergence of more musically flexible modes of verse. His principal subsequent collections are The Naked Ghost, it was published in 1984, and To Speak Simply, it was published in 1988, a selected edition of his poetry containing much previously uncollected material. When we go through his work, The Islanders, we can feel it is a human and natural aspects of the Caribbean. More than that, we can enjoy the music through this poem. Much of this best work from the early 1980s onward achieves striking dramatic effectiveness through his accomplished use of Jamaican patois. His poem, The Baptist, was published in Biting 2 by Cecil Gray. Among his other publications is the historical survey Great Families of Jamaica. It was published in 1984. He was the father of 5 daughters and 2 sons. He died in 1992 at the age of 69. We can go through his works. These Green Islands and Other Poems, To Speak Simply, Selected Poems, published in 1988. On This Mountain and Other Poems, published in 1965. Check, published in 1988. Naked Ghost and Other Poems, published in 1984. The Islanders and Other Poems, published in 1983. Mute, published in 1971. Madonna of the Unknown Nation, published in 1974. Great Families of Jamaica, published in 1984. Road to Lecovia, Albert, Jamaican Fragment. These are his works. You should keep in your memory at least 5 or 6 major works of A.L. Hendricks. I hope all of you got a clear picture about the writer A.L. Hendricks. You just go through the textbook about the author. I already told you, here we are going to enjoy a beautiful story of A.L. Hendricks, Jamaican Fragment. In this story, he highlights racism. So I want to speak about racism. What is racism? Racism, the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Racism, we can call it as an oppression or marginalization of people based on their skin color. Racism, also called racialism, the belief that humans may be divided into separate and exclusive biological entities called races. That there is a causal link between inherited physical traits and traits of personality, intellect, morality and other cultural and behavioral features, and that some races are innately superior to others. The term is also applied to political, economic or legal institutions and systems that engage in or perpetuate discrimination on the basis of race or otherwise reinforce racial inequalities in wealth and income, education, health care, civil rights and other areas. So I told you, based on the skin color, people are divided. It is based on inherited physical traits and traits of personality, intellect, morality and other cultural and behavioral features. We can see the discrimination on the basis of race. We can see the inequalities in wealth, income, education, health care, civil rights and so many areas. Such institutional, structural or systematic racism became a particular focus of scholarly investigation in the 1980s with the emergence of critical race theory, an offshoot of the critical legal studies movement. Since the late 20th century, the notion of biological race has been recognized as a cultural invention entirely without scientific basis. In 1980s, we can see the emergence of critical race theory. Late 20th century, the notion of biological race has been recognized as a cultural invention without a scientific basis. In North America and apartheid era, South Africa, racism dictated that different races, chiefly blacks and whites, should be segregated from one another, that they should have their own distinct communities and develop their own institutions such as churches, schools and hospitals, and that it was unnatural for members of different races to marry. When we speak about racism in North America, apartheid era, South Africa, we can see that the differences between mainly blacks and whites, they should be segregated from one another. They made their own communities. As the result, we can see that they have separate churches, schools, hospitals, etc. It was unnatural for the members of different races to marry. They can't agree that to marry from different communities. Historically, those who openly professed or practiced racism held that members of low status races should be limited to low status jobs, and that members of the dominant race should have exclusive access to political power, economic resources, high status jobs and unrestricted civil rights. As the result of racism, we can see the discrimination in all fields. As the result, the people who practiced racism, they held that members of low status races should be limited to low status jobs. We can see the discrimination among the people based on race. If a person belongs in a low status races, he done low status jobs. So we can see that the dominant race should have the power to control each and every field. They have the political power, economic resources, they enjoyed high status jobs, and even they were unrestricted civil rights. They had the right to disobey the civil rights. They enjoyed their life. The lived experience of racism for members of low status races includes acts of physical violence, daily insults, and frequent acts and verbal expressions of contempt and disrespect, all of which have profound effects on self-esteem and social relationships. So we can understand the feeling of low status races. They were insulted. They already lost their self-esteem and social relationships. Racism was at the heart of North American slavery and the colonization and empire building activities of Western Europeans, especially in the 18th century. The idea of race was invented to magnify the differences between people of European origin and those of African descent whose ancestors had been involuntarily enslaved and transported to the Americans. When we talk about racism in North America, we can see that slavery and colonization also became the part of their activities. We can see all these activities were developed and practiced in the 18th century. As the result, Africans were forced to be the slaves of Americans. By the 19th century, racism had matured and spread around the world. In many countries, leaders began to think of the ethnic components of their own societies, usually religious or language groups in racial terms, and to designate higher and lower races. We can see that by the 19th century, racism had matured and spread around the world. As the result, leaders began to think it very seriously. Those seen as the low status races, especially in colonized areas, were exploited for their labor, and discrimination against them became a common pattern in many areas of the world. The expressions and feelings of racial superiority that accompanied colonialism generated resentment and hostility from those who were colonized and exploited, feelings that continued even after independence. Because of this racism, people were exploited for their labor, and discrimination against them became a common pattern in many areas of the world. They were exploited maximum. Since the mid 20th century, many conflicts around the world have been interpreted in racial terms, even though their origins were in the ethnic hostilities that have long characterized many human societies. Example, Arabs and Jews, English and Irish. Racism reflects an acceptance of the deepest forms and degrees of divisiveness, and carries the implication that differences between groups are so great that they cannot be transcended. Racism elicits hatred and distrust and precludes any attempt to understand its victims. For that reason, most human societies have concluded that racism is wrong, at least in principle, and social trends have moved away from racism. Many societies have begun to combat racism by raising awareness of racist beliefs and practices and by promoting human understanding in public policies. As does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set forth by the United Nations in 1948. In the United States, racism came under increasing attack during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and laws and social policies that enforced racial segregation and permitted racial discrimination against African Americans were gradually eliminated. Laws aimed at limiting the voting power of racial minorities were invalidated by the 24th Amendment to the US Constitution, which prohibited poll taxes, and by the Federal Voting Rights Act, which required jurisdictions with a history of voter suppression to obtain federal approval of any proposed changes to their voting laws. So we can see that finally people started to protest against racism. As the result, laws started to control racism. Because in the popular mind, race is linked to physical differences among peoples, and such features as dark skin color have been seen as markers of low status. Some experts believe that racism may be difficult to eradicate. Indeed, minds cannot be changed by laws, but beliefs about human differences can and do change, as do all cultural elements. തീർച്ചയായും നിയമങ്ങളിലൂടെയല്ല നമ്മൾ റേസിസം പൂർണ്ണമായി തുടച്ചു മാറ്റേണ്ടത്, പകരം നമ്മുടെ ഓരോരുത്തരുടെയും മനസ്സിലൂടെയാണ്. എന്നിരുന്നാലേ ഈ ലോകത്ത് നിന്ന് റേസിസം ഉണ്ടാക്കിയിട്ടുള്ള എല്ലാ മുറിപ്പാടുകളും എന്നേക്കുമായി കാലത്തിന് മാറ്റാനായിട്ട് സാധിക്കുകയുള്ളൂ. I already told you racism is the main theme in this story, Jamaican Fragment. That's why I give a brief explanation about racism. So all of you please go through the textbook, page number 64, about the story. Let us start the story, Jamaican Fragment. Have you noticed the title of this story? Jamaican means belonging or relating to Jamaica or to its people or culture. A Jamaican is a person who comes from Jamaica. From the title itself, we can assume that through this story, he speaks about a Jamaican family or relating a Jamaican. Anyway, I want to give a brief introduction about the story. In the prose Jamaican Fragment, the author A.L. Hendricks says how prejudice mislead the person's opinion. We are also very smart to predict the things. Am I right? We have the tendency to predict the climax of the film. Even we are very confident to speak about the life of people who live around us. Like that here, our author A.L. Hendricks, he has also his own views about a family. Actually, he doesn't have any idea about this family. At the first sight itself, he starts to assume the things. But through this story, he proves that prejudice misleads the person's opinion. Jamaican Fragment is a personal essay in which Hendricks talks about a lesson he learned from his usual walks to the tram line. Based on a real life experience, A.L. Hendricks presents the question of race and universal brotherhood using humor and irony. Actually, it is the life experience of A.L. Hendricks. He had the habit of walking. Through this story, he questions the race and universal brotherhood using humor and irony. Jamaican Fragment tells the story of a Jamaican who witnesses a young white boy imposing his will upon a little black boy. Jamaican Fragment deals with a Jamaican's internal suspicions regarding racial inferiority in his homeland. So, if you please take the page number 65 in your textbook. Let us begin the story. Every day I walk a half mile from my home to the tramcar lines in the morning and from the lines to my home in the evening. The walk is pleasant. The road on either side is flanked by red and green roofed bungalows, green lawns and gardens. The exercise is good for me, and now and then I learn something from a little incident. One morning, about halfway between my front gate and the tram track, I noticed two little boys playing in the garden of the more modest cottages. They were little boys. One was 4 years old, perhaps the other 5. The bigger of the two was a sturdy youngster, very dark, with a mat of coarse hair on his head and coal black eyes. He was definitely a little Jamaican, a strong little Jamaican. The other little fellow was a smaller but also sturdy. He was white with hazel eyes and light brown hair. Both were dressed in blue shirts and khaki pants. They wore no shoes and their feet were muddy. They were not conscious of my standing there. Watching them, they played on. The game, if it could be called a game, was not elaborate. The little white boy strode imperiously up and down, and every now and then shouted imperiously at his bigger playmate. The little brown boy shuffled along quietly behind him and did what he was told. We can go through the glossary. Flanked means having on both sides. Modest means not very large in size. Sturdy means strong and healthy. Coarse hair. Coarse means very rough. Hazel means reddish or greenish brown. Strode imperiously means walked hotly with long steps. Shuffled along means walked slowly by dragging one's feet. As he walks one morning, he notices a young black boy and a young white boy playing in the garden. After a deep observation, he realizes that the white boy was dominating the black boy, while the black boy submitted himself. Struggling to find reason behind the black boy's lack of resistance, the man's faith in his people was shaken for the day. Thus the lesson brings out the prejudice that almost every person suffers from denominational issues like color, caste, sex, etc. I already told you it is the life experience of A.L. Hendricks. More than that, he is a Jamaican. When he walks, he observes two boys are playing. One is black and the other is white. The white boy is dominating over the black boy. Unknowingly, he has the tendency to connect it with a race, color, and so he asks so many questions to himself. He can't give the answers. So the whole day he thinks about the dominating power of the whites over the black. Through this story, he proves that the prejudice that almost every person suffers from denominational issues like color, caste, sex, etc. That's why I told you we can't eliminate racism by laws. At first, you should eradicate racism from your thoughts. This incident happened in Arthur's life. He depicted it very well. Every day, the narrator used to walk half mile from his home to railway track in the morning and evening. The walk is pleasant to him because of the red and green roofed bungalows, green lawns and gardens on either side, and it gives good exercise. So he enjoys his walking. One morning, the narrator noticed that two little boys were playing in the garden. One is black and another is white. The narrator observed the children. The black boy might be 5 years and white boy is little lesser, maybe 4 years old. The white boy is shouting and commanding the black boy. But both of them wear the same colored dress. They wear blue shirts and khaki pants. But their skin color is different. More than that, the white boy is commanding to the black boy. So he has a lot of questions in his mind. What is the reason behind it? Why the little black boy is obeying the white boy? What is the reason? I know you are very interested to know what happened in the story, but you should wait. We will continue the rest of the story in our next class. Thank you.